Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the microbiome as it relates to kind of this idea of good versus bad bugs, understanding obesity and weight management, and what the microbiome can indicate as imbalance in that area, and then GI disorders, which, it's kind of the bread and butter of gut health is this idea of microbiome health, bacteria balance, and healthy gut lining. So I just want to kind of preface this talk with the idea that these are not diagnosis for any of these concerns. So it's not to say that the microbiome is the only culprit contributing to your weight loss resistance or your, gut health that seems to be out of control. But there definitely is a correlation, and you can see that in the research and in people's own experiences, so both anecdotal and clinical experiences that I've had and my colleagues, as well as people that actually write research papers and are much cooler than me. So that being said, correlation is not causation. So we can look at some really cool strains that have, shown to increase weight loss. We can look at, the mucosa in the GI lining that's got these good versus bad bacteria in people that have celiac disease. But that does not mean that it is the cause. There is an imbalance, and we can help the body shift towards more health and healing by supporting the microbiome. And then at the end, I'll talk to you guys about what some things you can do, both nutrition and lifestyle, that will make an impact on your health goals by supporting the microbiome. So let's get started. So I do not love the idea of good versus bad when it comes to just about anything. I don't like the idea of good versus bad food. I think that creates this distinction in our brains and our bodies that's not healthful or helpful in any way, shape, or form. But what it really does matter in um, the microbiome is location and diversity. So these are some different strains of bacteria that are commonly colonized in different areas. So if you see like Streptococcus dominates the oral cavity, well, everyone thinks, oh no, well, when I have strep throat, then I know I'm sick. The same with staph on the skin. Well, oh, I have a staph infection and that's bad. So everything with the microbiome is about balance, and it is consistently and constantly trying to regulate and heal itself. So if we can get out of the way a little bit, those imbalances will right themselves and we won't have these overgrowth of problems. Just like the E. coli in the gut, everyone says, oh no, I have E. coli. Well, yes, you do have E. coli, and non-pathogenic E. coli in the right location and the right amount is very important for your body. I think it's really interesting. There's some cool research coming out about using probiotic mists for eczema and atopic dermatitis and, skin problems or fungal infections or whatever else they are, with these consistent skin issues people have. This probiotic sprays, something like Mother Dirt, actually recolonizing the skin bacteria or supporting good bacteria on the skin, and then it starts to right itself. And once it's reestablished a balance and we stop putting on it topical things or stop eating things that are causing a reduction in the healthy balance of bacteria, our skin problems just go away, which is awesome. Another one is, so we look at the vaginal tract and the lactobacillus species that are predominant there. Lots of really cool information coming out about using probiotic douches for women that suffer from chronic yeast infections and bacterial vaginosis. Those are to say those symptoms are like flags that are saying, oh, there's something wrong going on in the balance in the body if those things are present. So when we work on healing the body and getting the body to stop producing and help the body balance, something like a vaginal douche actually of probiotics actually helps shift the balance even faster and deals with the symptoms while we work on getting the body back online. So I said before, location, location, location. Where the bugs are seriously matters. So, for example, when we talk about oral health, which is tied to overall health, right? chewable probiotics that really sit in the mouth and help change the flora can affect the whole body, just like we know with our feet, right? Our feet are connected to all of our different systems. The mouth is really critical to our health. So kids or adults that really have significant cavities could benefit from eating fresh fruits and vegetables that are local, grown in the actual dirt, and then having some kind of chewable probiotic or fermented food come into contact with their mouth. That's why the spit test with kids is so effective. You can say, hey, you try this sauerkraut or try this fermented salsa or this whatever, and if you don't like it, you can spit it out because we know there's millions of bacteria that are still have made it at least into the mouth to start shifting the overall balance. Um, so the location thing, when small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is the term that refers to this gut flora that has crawled backward into the small intestine from the colon, and it belongs in the colon, it doesn't belong in the small intestine. So where the bacteria is in correlation with the body is important too. So making sure that we are getting everything where it needs to go. And that's a large part of like a 5R gut healing program is figuring out what each person's individual location problem is for bacteria, understanding the diversity, and then looking for quantity as well. With obesity, we see this shift of much more Firmicutes and very few Bacteroides, which are the two main dominant groups. And that's across the board. Lots of really interesting research on that as well. So we've talked about several locations like the mouth and the skin and the other areas of the body that, consist of the microbiome. It's not just the gut, but the gut is seriously important. And so we usually spend more time talking about that than anything else because, as we know, the gut is really the root of our health and wellness. So it harbors the greatest density of microorganisms in the body. And in like agreement with these animal studies that I was talking to you about, it seems that there's this human obesity link with a reduced abundance of Bacteroides and higher Firmicutes. That's not across the board. There are other methane-producing bacteria that can be the culprit if, diet and exercise and all of those things is on point and we're still having these weight issues. Or, if you are like one of those people that looks at a cookie and gains 5 pounds as opposed to your skinny sister sitting next to you and she has 2 dozen. That doesn't mean that that's a healthful decision, but your body is reacting much differently, obviously, to the same amount of calories because we know calories in, calories out is just a joke. So you can test for the types of bacteria that, like the Firmicutes, Bacteroides, these methane-producing bacteria, in a comprehensive stool analysis that ranges anywhere from $300 to $600 depending on the practitioner and the type of test. And you can just target and understand where potential inflammation, removing harmful bacteria that show up or things like that shows on the test. But it really comes down to abundance, balance, diversity, and real estate. So the bacteria that has the most real estate is the one that's going to have the largest influence in the body. And if someone is struggling with obesity, has any issues of gut health or had in the past, or we can kind of point a finger at that, we're going to look at this Firmicutes Bacteroides balance. So I don't love the idea of thinking about bad bacteria. And even Raphael Kellman, who's a doctor, one of those guys that I learned about the microbiome from, he even goes so far as to emphasize a positive attitude towards these bacteria. He thanks his bacteria daily. He acknowledges the fact that the bacteria in and on his body is what's keeping him alive because we have outsourced so many jobs to the microbiome, and feels as though if we stop thinking negatively about this bacteria imbalance problem, then it really shifts just by the mental power of having positive thoughts towards these little bugs. So really interesting research in that aspect. Oh, okay, so here's my mice. I love these guys. So we have Gus Gus and Jacques, right, our notobiotic mice. So in human populations, it's evident that this highly processed diet and overconsumption of food is the greatest predicator for obesity. Um, the bacteria, the microbiome, all of these other things, genetics, they all play a role, but really overeating and eating poor quality food is the biggest responsible culprit for obesity. So, but my question is, what happens when diet and exercise fails to create lasting change, right? We all know, or we all are, yo-yo dieters that put the weight on and off and on and off, and then all of a sudden this window of losing gets smaller, and then we gain a little more, and we just kind of become the perfect storm of diet and exercise weight loss resistance. So, we really start to think about this altered host metabolism and immune homeostasis based on these past dieting and changes that have occurred and have changed the intestinal microbiota. So the role of the microbiota in metabolism, actually its job is to help you get energy from your food. So it's a really insignificant environmental factor impacting the risk of metabolic disease. There is a direct link between intestinal microbiota composition and body weight from studies using these gnotobiotic mice, right? So what happens is you take these two twins, we have our two mice here, and we induce metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, and obesity in Gus, by feeding him a diet high in high fructose corn syrup. Just going to wait for a minute. Yep, we give him high fructose corn syrup to make him fat and sick. So that's a good clue on something to avoid if you don't want to be fat and sick. And then they put them both on the same diet. They take stool samples from them. So now we have a skinny brother and a fat brother. And we take stool samples from both of them and we put them in a family group of, like a sibling group of mice that have similar genetics, and you divide that group in two. So one half of the group gets the skinny mice poo and a fecal transplant, and one group gets the fat mice poo. And you'll never guess what happened. The fat mice got fat, eating the same diet that they had eaten before, and the skinny mouse remains the same. They did not have alterations in their weight or their health levels. Metabolic syndrome was quick in coming to those that had the fecal transplant from the obese mouse, and we really see the correlation between poor diet, altered microbiome, lasting consequences in microbiome health that brings us back to, that keeps us in this crazy cycle of inflammation related to obesity, related to insulin resistance, related to altered metabolism. So really interesting also cravings, right? So if you've ever binged on, cakes, cookies, pizza, whatever your go-to junk food is, all of a sudden your cravings for that food intensify the next day or the next time you're exposed to it. And that is because the microbes actually send a signal to your brain with regulatory hormones so that you crave the foods that those microbes need to survive. So we kind of gave those bad bugs a smorgasbord. Now that they have a little bit more real estate in our gut, they have a louder voice and they can alter our brain. It's creepy and cool. So then we talk about also the short chain fatty acid production, potentially actually more important in the development of obesity than the actual bugs themselves. So it's not always just the bugs, it's what they do for us, right? So this is one we won't get really deep into, but colon cancer is one of those things that I really don't want to get. But with all of my health issues, I was at a much higher risk for when I was having my health crisis. And knowing that healthy colon cells get 60 to 70% of their energy from short-chain fatty acid oxidation, and knowing that those short-chain fatty acids that are produced by the microbiome are significantly in low quantities when we have an imbalance of gut bacteria really makes me want to put my mouth where my research is, right, and eat this diverse diet full of pre and probiotic foods so that I have a healthy colon and then don't have to have a little bag to go to the bathroom outside my body. Since we're talking about bacterial products, here's my little plug for another important organs, right? So products of bacterial metabolism have been associated with fighting diseases that affect the liver, cardiovascular system, and kidneys, all pretty important players in overall health of the body. All right, so when we talk about gastrointestinal disorders, we could spend months and months really diving into the intricacies of the microbiome, gut health, and these GI disorders that are really prevalent. But we'll just pick a few to highlight. So when we look at inflammatory bowel diseases, so IBD, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis are the most prevalent ones, and they're characterized by this chronic relapsing inflammation that infects the intestinal mucosa. So we can't always understand like the etiology behind the development of these diseases, but there's increasing evidence that the microbial dysbiosis has a role in the pathogenesis, has a role in like how this diseases present. So in each of these conditions, less diversity and specific strains that they can test for are seen in either overabundance, and then there's some that are consistently seen in fewer quantities. And the problem is that it's really difficult to say, well, is this the trigger that resulted in this chronic inflammation, or is this altered microbiome a result of the chronic inflammation? But I have seen several studies that showed dysbiosis differentials between newly diagnosed GI disorders in these categories and their altered microbiome as compared to the control group, which is significantly different. So there's something to say for, okay, right at the onset of this, onset of this gastrointestinal disorder or disease, we can see a trend in dysbiosis that alters from the control group. So that's really interesting. Getting ahead of a diagnosis is so important. When we look at gut healing, an average of 1 month per year that a person struggled with an imbalance is the number I like to throw out. So if you've only had gut problems for a year, we're looking at a much shorter turnaround time to be able to understand your imbalance and then to heal it. Other disorders, like in addition to irritable bowel disease, metabolic disorders, obesity, and type 2 diabetes, this intestinal microbiota has been implicated in other GI issues, such as irritable bowel syndrome, which I just kind of like to call cranky guts, aka we don't know what's wrong with you. It's kind of the IBS diagnosis, as well as celiac disease, and of course my least favorite, colorectal cancer. You can see in each of those cases significant changes in the microbiota composition that's different than healthy individuals. In colorectal cancer and celiac disease, we tend to put more emphasis on the genetic expression as the most important and relevant risk factor for both the development of the disease and then the long-term success and outcomes. But it's really interesting to see that children with genetic risk factors for celiac disease actually have been shown to have altered microbiota composition compared to those without the marker, even prior to clinically relevant symptoms or diagnosis of the disease. So is the genetic aspect decreasing microbial health that then when we get to, the tipping point, you have full-blown symptomology and you become a celiac? I don't know. So celiac disease results from this T cell reactivity to gliadin, this gluten protein. And guess what? Some bacterial species are actually able to digest gliadin, this protein that's found in wheat that causes immune response in people with celiac. So there are bacterial species that do this job. So I wonder if that's that's the microbiota composition shift that we're looking at. The body is trying to outsource as, it's realizing it doesn't have this ability to break this down. So having a substantial amount of that bacteria could in fact help mediate the immune response to ingested gliadin for celiac patients. Taking this one step further, right, which I always do, here's another plug for fermented foods. Fermented foods have actually been shown to alter and support epigenetic switches. So this switch, whether it's turned on or off in the first place, could be in fact mediated by eating fermented foods. And then we're outsourcing even more this gliadin, breakdown, which would be great. So it's hard to know, like I said before, what's the trigger and what's the symptom, like which came first. Some common triggers are for getting dysbiosis in the gut or missing micronutrients, history of stomach bugs, even just one bad gut bug episode, parasite in Mexico or really bad stomach flu, food poisoning, whatever, can trigger an imbalance in the gut. And with building a timeline with clients is really useful for this. history of antibiotic use either for acne or chronic, sinus infections, something like that. Use of antacids for heartburn, reflux, or hiatal hernia. Sinus congestion is actually a trigger and a symptom that shows our body is constantly trying to fight either a low, this inflammatory response or a low-lying infection. Prolonged stress. Man, we'll have lots of time to talk about how stress affects the microbiome. Trauma or traumatic experience, and then C-section because you're reducing the amount of bacteria that are being exposed to the baby right off of the bat. Symptoms include, but are not limited to, of course, gas and bloating, lots of mucus in your stool. We look at gallbladder health a lot for that. Brain fog, anxiety, and depression. We'll touch on that in the food, mood, microbiome, gut-brain connection lecture. Lots of food sensitivities having to do with that leaky gut, chronic bad breath, and this imbalance of bacteria, what's fermenting in the gut and what kind of bacteria do we have in the mouth. Any kind of gut issues like diarrhea, constipation, or like a mix of both. Diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome. I love having people come into my office with irritable bowel syndrome because it's such a vague diagnosis. And then once we figure out their core imbalance, they start feeling better really quickly, and that's really encouraging. And then fatigue, not being able to eat carbs, or if you eat carbs, you feel bloated or gassy because you just don't have those bacteria to break down those fibers. So this is a really cool study that showed the dietary patterns in the high-fat, high-sugar Western diet as opposed to Mediterranean diet. And then they, of course, looked at this gluten-free diet, which was actually full of gluten-free foods, so still processed foods, not necessarily an increase in whole foods and those kind of things. But what they found was that after 24 hours of a dietary shift to a westernized kind of SAD diet, standard American diet, even after just 24 hours, there was a noticeable pathogenic shift in the bacteria. So I don't want to take cheat day away from you, right? But it's important to know that a single day of eating crap food can alter your microbiome to increase the amount of pathogenic bacteria that's going on in there. I will tell you the other part of the study, which showed that people who normally ate whole foods, including yogurt, soups, fruits, and vegetables, like every day, had a much smaller negative reaction to this microbial shift in the 24-hour kind of binge diet than those that ate a typical SAD diet or a less nutrient-dense diet. So since chronic low-grade inflammation appears to be this major factor in the development of obesity-related metabolic disturbances, it's so important to address underlying causes of inflammation. And we'll talk more about that in the gut healing lecture, but I just want you to understand that inflammation increases intestinal permeability, which decreases insulin sensitivity and really increases oxidative stress. So we can talk a little bit about strain specifics here. I can't guarantee I'll say all of these names right, so don't hold me to that. But there's a ton of really cool research, both in the lab with mice and then in humans. One of those showed that following a probiotic treatment, body weight gain was 38% lower in a probiotic group than in the placebo group. And these people, or these mice, I know, they're all the same, were eating the same exact diet, but they were much more efficient at losing weight on this probiotic complex. And then the food efficacy ratio was reduced by 29%, so indicating lower weight gain per grams of food consumed. Then they did a 12-week study with this Lactobacilli paracasei and Lactobacilli rhamnosus, as well as the Bifido animalis, and they noticed that this weight gain, they lost weight despite no reduction in the food that they were giving them. So these mice, they didn't put on a diet, they just gave them the probiotic mix, and they lost weight when they were allowed to still eat as much as they wanted to. So then they found some anti-obesity properties of probiotic yeast, and like Saccharomyces boulardii, which is one of those things we use to fight small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. It's kind of a yeast on yeast battle. And they found that this Saccharomyces boulardii changed the gut microbiome composition, increased the Bacteroides, and decreased the Firmicutes, right, which was the balance we were looking for, and we see the imbalance consistently in obese individuals. Then they had Lactobacilli, Bacillus curvatus, and Plantarum, which is one of my favorites, actually prevented the development of a high fructose diet-induced metabolic syndrome. So they're trying to make these mice be sick, right, with this high fructose diet. When they gave the high fructose, infusion or whatever, fed them this diet, when they were supplemented as well with the curvatus and the plantarum, it prevented metabolic syndrome, lowered like the plasma glucose, insulin, and triglycerides level compared to those in the control group. And all of these were associated with reduction in oxidative stress. Really cool recent evidence suggests that the gut microbiota is involved in this control of body weight and energy homeostasis, as well as this inflammation, which means prebiotics and probiotics can actually alter the composition of the gut microbiota to affect food intake and appetite, body weight, and composition, as well as the metabolic functions through the gut by this modulation of the community of microbiome. There's been studies with lactobacilli gastriae. For 12 weeks, people lost weight around their belly, which is the belly weight is our biggest concern for lasting complications and health concerns when we look at being overweight. Another 3-month study with women taking probiotics versus a control lost 50% more weight compared to those that were taking the control. And then they continued to lose weight during the weight maintenance phase of the study. So this was a particular diet put together with a group of similar individuals. So what can we do, right? I've already told you a little bit about my beef with probiotics, although obviously these strains have been studied to have these benefits, and I think that they would be positive to include when diet and exercise is not getting you to your goals. You can download Chronometer, Chronometer. It's T-E-R, sorry. It's a free app that you can have. It's similar to MyFitnessPal, but it's actually going to give you the nutrient breakdown of all the micronutrients and minerals of the food that you're eating, so you understand and see if you're eating a balanced diet, if you really are getting all of your selenium and your molybdenum and your essential amino acids in your diet, because as we saw before, a massive trigger is nutrient deficiencies that we may not even realize we have. You can give yourself a nutrition-focused physical exam, and I'll give you a handout for that, to look at your body and see signs and symptoms of potential nutrient deficiencies. Of course, you can eat fermented foods. For everyone, that is a different thing. If you need to start slow, then start slow. We're talking a teaspoon a day, that's fine. But slowly start introducing fermented foods into your diet to shift the balance of the microbiome in favor of eating healthy, whole foods that are in season, colorful. You can look for the Environmental Working Groups page to see the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15 to make sure that you're getting foods that have not been altered to the point that they're not healthful any longer, that don't have chemicals on them that will disrupt the microbiome further. Eating local is huge. Foods that have been grown in the soil where you live. Health benefits are out of this world. The polyphenols, their bioactive metabolites, they all have an effect on the modulation of the intestinal microbiota. Then, of course, probiotic supplementation. I think I see daily in my clinical practice health shifts to a positive state using probiotic interventions. You want to look for diversity in the strains and quantity of the number of CFUs, and you want to make sure that you're not taking the same probiotic every year round. We switch every about 3 months to continue to increase this diversity, right? Because we know probiotics change the microbiome for a short period of time. They don't create lasting change. And then get outside. Being outside changes how your body metabolizes. It can alter your circadian rhythms, decrease your cholesterol, help you manage your stress. It can even change your neurotransmitters just by being outside in the dirt, touching the ground. You can buy that expensive probiotic spray, or you can take up gardening as a habit. If you don't have a garden, volunteer at a community garden. Go to the park, lay on the ground by the lake or the river. Have those experiences, and besides reducing your stress and focusing on, your mental health, you're going to be altering your microbiome by doing that, by increasing your exposure. Take up camping if you're like adventurous. So, all right, so that's going to be it for today. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and best of health.